All right, good morning, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the latest installment of Mazzetti's Bending the Climate Curve Learning Series. I'm Christina Vernon-Sanborn, Sustainability Practice Leader here at Mazzetti, where Bending the Climate Curve is our mission. This morning, we'll talk about Mass General's Greening the Lab initiative. I'm really excited about today's session. We're going to explore the climate crisis through the lens of evolutionary influences that are shaping human decision-making. We'll gain a unique perspective to better frame this challenge, promoting pro-environmental behaviors. The discussion will address the implications for healthcare sustainability in clinics and research labs, the establishment of global priorities and policies, and strategies for shifting paradigms toward both immediate and long-term goals. Joining us today is Anne-Christine Duhaime. Dr. Duhaime is a senior pediatric neurosurgeon at the Massachusetts General Hospital and is the Nicholas T. Zervas Distinguished Professor of Neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School. Her neuroscience research investigates mechanisms, pathophysiology, imaging, and treatment of injury in the immature brain, using translational and clinical approaches to study injuries occurring in infants and young children, including those seen most commonly in child abuse. The work also investigates plasticity, recovery, and return of brain function in children and adolescents during maturation. Dr. Duhaime also has a longstanding interest in the relationship between brain and behavior and in environmental issues. She's a faculty associate at the Harvard University Center for the Environment. Beginning with a fellowship at the Radcliffe Institute in 2016, she has explored the neurobiology of reward circuitry and plasticity and its relevance to pro-environmental behavior, and has also worked with a diverse team to design a prototype of advanced green biophilic pediatric hospital. Her book on this work, called Minding the Climate, was awarded the Sustainability Book of the Year in 2023 by Project Syndicate. She now serves as Associate Director of the Massachusetts General Hospital Center for the Environment and Health, supervising the research pillar, and serves as Associate Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Climate Change and Health. And through the Harvard Global Health Institute is pursuing interdisciplinary collaboration on the intersection of climate change, war, and health. Today, we're going to talk about how this brain science influences decision-making by humans, because we're all humans and need to be making better decisions. We'll understand the connections between this brain science and pro-environmental behavior, what's been shown to work, and compared to less successful strategies. Participants will learn about effective efforts towards sustainability in research and clinical operations in academic medical centers, and will gain a practical knowledge about the scope and scale of sustainability-focused actions and operations, education and engagement, policy and advocacy for professionals in the healthcare sector. A quick bit of housekeeping before we get started. Today's event qualifies for one AIA Health, Safety, and Welfare CEU. If you didn't provide your AIA number when registering, please send it to info@mazzetti.com. We will hold questions until after today's speaker has made her presentation, but you're encouraged to ask your questions at any time during the presentation via the Q&A function of the webinar. So go ahead and enter those questions as they occur to you. We will get to them at the end of the presentation. Today's session is being recorded. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Duhaime.
Thanks so much, Christina, and happy Earth Month to you and your team and to all those online here. This is a little bit different from your usual presentation, probably, and I'll give you a little bit of the background as to how we got here. So I will share my slides. How's that?
Perfect.
Got it?
Yeah.
All right, great. I always struggle with getting the bar off of the top so I can see. There we go. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit, as Christina said, about a particular manifestation of this work, which is our work on our biomedical research laboratories. But I'd like to give you a little bit of background about how we got here and sort of why. Because I'm a neurosurgeon, what am I doing talking about this? It perhaps doesn't make a lot of sense. Let's see, there we go. Because I am not a climate expert. I know some of you here are climate experts for sure, and certainly industrial climate experts and consulting climate experts. But this was my field, and sorry for those of you who are squeamish, this is the kind of work that we do and that I've done for about 40 years, taking care of children at some of the worst times in their lives, and certainly the worst time for their families across the range of the sorts of things that pediatric neurosurgeons see. And it's a very rewarding career. You take care of a few kids at a time through very intense problems. Oftentimes, families are totally disrupted by many of these conditions, and so it's very fulfilling. But I will say that I found over time that the problem of climate change became increasingly part of what was on my mind. And you've all seen curves like this. This is at the graph at the top, it's carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere over hundreds of thousands of years, probably going back to at least 1.5 million years, where there were fluctuations for sure in carbon dioxide parts per million in the atmosphere, but it never got above about 300 parts per million until the industrial age, and particularly it's accelerated over time, so that this graph, for anybody who knows how to read graphs, is a really alarming change. And, it was easy for me to think during the early parts of my medical career that this was sort of somebody else's problem in some other place, some other time, until in 1998, the very persuasive and critically thinking environmental writer Bill McKibben put out an article in the Atlantic. It was a 3-part article that the Atlantic had commissioned at the turn of the century, the turn of the millennia, really, about big ideas. And so Mr. McKibben wrote a 3-part article that basically made me understand that this is our problem. This was my problem, even though, I was busy taking care of children and so forth. We in the industrialized world, our carbon sort of balloon that we carry around our head, if we could put all our carbon emissions in a balloon, we're like that Stay Puft. What is he? Stay Puft. I forgot what he's called, but the big balloon in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. And most of the world are the people down at the sidelines with the little party balloons that per capita here in the US and in other wealthy industrialized countries, our individual carbon footprint, our carbon emissions fills one of those big balloons, not the little balloons. So this really is our responsibility and our problem, or at least that's how I came to think of it based on Mr. McKibben's very effective persuasion. So I started to think that there was a conflict between sort of my self-satisfaction with taking care of kids and getting them better and sort of this big global problem. And my sort of aha moment came with this particular child and his family. And this child had epilepsy that was really ruining his life and was progressing. It had a particular disorder where the only thing you can do to treat it, someday we'll have better treatments if all the medical funding for research is not permanently cut off. But at the present time, still, the best treatment for this child's condition, a condition called Rasmussen's encephalitis, is to remove or disconnect one whole half of his brain so that the other half can take over as much function as possible, but that's what stops the progression. And it was a long, involved decision-making process over a few years where the child himself eventually said, just do the surgery because I'm losing my function. And he had the wherewithal to request the surgery, which helped his parents. And after his surgery, which did cure his seizures, he's weak on one side, but his parents sent me these photographs at the bottom because the child himself insisted he was going to climb this fire tower that's on the top of a big rocky outcrop in New Hampshire where he lived. And his mom sent me the picture on the right saying that this spoke to her because it was like he was looking out over the rest of his life and it was a life without epilepsy. But I took this picture and it really touched me because I thought those beautiful forests, that beautiful landscape, those beautiful ecosystems, we're not doing anything. I'm not doing anything to protect them for all the children, not just the children that pass through my hands, but all the children in the world and in the future. And that moment, this photograph really made me change my trajectory. And because I'm a neurosurgeon and a neuroscience researcher, everything I think about is about the brain. It's just like if you're an artist, you think about color and form, or if you're a farmer, you think about crops and weather. But we in the neurosciences think about the brain and see the world through that lens. And I've come to believe that everybody's lens has utility and value, that this is how nature intended it, for us to have different talents and different predispositions, because collectively we do better than any of us could individually. So the way I thought about the climate change problem is that it's a brain problem, in the sense that it's a choice of behaviors. We have the technologies to stop this problem, but we don't choose to use them. We don't choose to prioritize those actions that would solve the problem. And I saw it as a brain problem, in the sense that because we don't behave this way, because we don't make these choices, we have our reasons. And our reasons are can be traced back to the way our brain was designed by evolution to work. So I framed the question this way: what is it about the way our brains evolved and are designed by those evolutionary pressures that makes it hard for us to change behaviors that are destroying our planet, that would seem self-destructive? And it is, but we keep doing it. And then if we understood that, or we at least got some insights into it, do we have the capacity to change? We have the technologic capacity to change, but we don't have the will and the behavioral capacity. And I thought that this was an interesting question to try to approach. So I was lucky, because I'm in academia. What can you do in academia that most people don't get the opportunity to do? And that is take a sabbatical. So for a drastic pay cut, if you've got your seniority in many institutions, you can take a year off and go back to school, which is what I did. I went back to the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard, and I got a bunch of wonderful students to help me, and I just delved into this topic. And what we came up with in this kind of quest for what is it in our neurobiology that underpins our difficulty with sustainable behavior are the following main points. Basically, we're lacking the neural equipment to even perceive CO2 and its consequences. If you went outside and driving your SUV made the sky turn orange, and you could see that one-to-one relation, and you could perceive CO2, if it smelled bad, if it irritated your eyes, if it were visible to you, you'd have a better grasp of it. But it's totally invisible. We did not need to evolve the ability to sense CO2. It was not important, because the CO2 level was always safe for us. And so Mother Nature didn't waste anything on stuff that wasn't relevant to our survival. Another main point that we took away was that pro-environmental behavior just isn't very rewarding. And I mentioned how rewarding my career is: taking care of a child, having a family thank you, having the child send me a graduation picture 5 years later, having them send me their wedding photos because I played a role in their life. That's extremely rewarding. Coming out of the operating room and knowing that the child's life is no longer in danger, that's really, really immediately rewarding. But when you do something pro-environmental, it is not the same set of rewards. It just didn't need to be in evolution, and we'll get into that in a moment. And then pro-environmental decisions just won't feel like most of your decisions. So if you want to know more about this, we put all of these findings and the, I don't know, several, maybe 1,000 references that we found in literature over the years of scientific research to back it up into this book that's called Minding the Climate. And, if you're more interested, I'll be happy to, you can just find it online. So let's talk a little bit about this concept of reward, because this is central to this whole idea. And then what do we do about the fact that we are not terribly rewarded for pro-environmental behavior? Can we change that? So what is reward? Reward is not, and when we're using it in this context, it's not like the points you get on a credit card that give you a free flight somewhere or whatever. It's not, buy two, get one free. Reward is, in the neurobiologic sense, it's your brain's way of teaching you what you need to survive. So let's delve into that a little bit and see what we're talking about. Your brain evolved this incredible, what is called reward circuitry. And it's designed, and we've learned about it from a variety of different ways shown at the bottom. It's what makes you feel wonderful when it's a beautiful spring day, like it was yesterday here in Boston. It's what makes you feel good when you put a lot of effort into something and then you succeed, like when you win a race. That was all designed over millions and millions and millions of years of evolution. And we've gotten quite a good understanding of it now through modern neuroscience technology. And this did not just come with humans. This started with the earliest organisms. Single cell organisms like the bacteria E. coli, they can turn towards sugars that are nutritious and away from acids, which are toxic. And they just have one cell. And the way it's done is the basic underpinnings of most biologic principles. Something on the surface of that organism interacts with something in the environment, and it changes the shape of the thing on their cell surface. And that change in shape starts this chain reaction that turns into a behavior, even at the single cell level. And that's the basic principle of all biology, not just neurobiology. So when you get into single cell, multicellular organisms like this little C. elegans, the reward system is much more developed. It has 302 neurons, and we know which do what. And then when you get into bigger organisms like the sea slug, giant sea slug, which is about a foot in size, we can see how the reward system helps the organism to learn what it needs to survive, in this case, particular types of feeding behavior, so that if the animal happens to swallow something that's nutritious, the circuitry says, try that again, do that again, and it rewards that behavior with neurotransmitters that are the same neurotransmitters we have. You've probably all heard of dopamine, same thing in the sea slug. So this is not brand new to us. This evolved over as long as life has been on the planet. So let's think about creatures that we know a little bit more about. Why does the squirrel store nuts? Why are there hickory trees growing up all over my property? Because like they plant these hickory seeds. They figured out how to do that, not consciously, but it's rewarding for them to do that. Similarly, early humans, figured out through trial and error how to preserve food, how to build shelter, how to domesticate animals, how to start agriculture, how to weave textiles that could be turned into protective clothing. And everything that they learned was rewarding in some way and became incorporated into their reward system. Why? Because it helped them to survive. And as a general principle, while there are exceptions to this, the more you have, the more rewarding it is. And so there's this underlying principle in mammals about more is better, and more is better and better and better. The problem is we did not in evolutionary history need to develop really strong breaks. So while you have some breaks that tell you don't eat that fourth piece of pie, they're not very strong breaks. And so what's happened is that because our urges to get more evolutionarily are longer and more entrenched than any brake system we evolved to say that's more than you need, it's threatening the planet. So do you really need a meal like that? Not only do you not need it, it's actually unhealthy. And I always hesitate showing this picture of this enormous house because I always worry someday somebody in the audience, it'll be their house. So if this is your house, I apologize in advance. But if it's your house, I feel like I'm on firm grounds to say nobody needs a house that big. We just don't need it for our survival. But it's hard to turn off the brakes that say, geez, if it's bigger, if it's, another story, another wing, it's better. It's rewarding. So if you think about this in another way, my students helped me come up with this diagram, and it's sort of central to the whole premise. So if you think about our evolutionary history as a map of the United States, a timeline, and Christina, can you see my cursor moving? I don't know if you can see it. You can. Okay. So let's pretend that you're doing a walk across the United States, and you start in San Francisco and you walk at Google walk pace. And this is where the Earth starts, about 4.5 billion years ago. And the students chose this. I would have chose the Atlantic Ocean, but they chose the middle of Times Square as the present time. And you walk at Google Earth walk pace, it's going to take you 40 days to walk from when the Earth starts to now, which is the center of Times Square. So let's look at some of the big events in that time frame. So here's the Earth forming. The first organisms, single cell organisms, start in Salt Lake City, Utah. You get to multicellular organisms in Iowa City. You don't get to mammals till Scranton. You don't get to primates till Morristown, New Jersey. And you don't get to humans until you're 223 yards before the present time. So this is how long your nervous system and your reward system and how you make decisions took to evolve to help you make the decisions that you make every day today. And the Anthropocene, that time when climate change has become a problem, It doesn't happen until your last step and your big toe hits that last step. It's your big toe that is the Anthropocene in this timeline. You have not had time, biology has not had time to let your brain evolve for this problem and to find pro-environmental behavior rewarding. Your brain evolved back here, not when your big toe hit the last step in the current era of climate change. And this is when the carbon dioxide levels lined up here. That's that enormous carbon dioxide increase that just happened too soon for us to catch up. So as an illustration of this, just consider for a moment as a thought experience. What's more fun? Picking out your new car, the color, the interior, the design, or thinking about the gas mileage? What's more fun? Decorating your house for a holiday? Sorry, I'm a little out of season here with this one. Or putting in, think of how exciting this is, putting in attic insulation. And I'm not asking you what's more valuable, what's more cognitively important, what makes you feel like a better person. I'm asking you what's more fun. Fun is the embodiment of what the human brain finds rewarding. And most fun can be traced back to what was evolutionarily adaptive for short-term survival and reproduction. So now that we know that we are not well suited for pro-environmental behavior in general being rewarding, and I'm not saying that it isn't rewarding, it can be cognitive rewarding, it can be, oh, I did the right thing rewarding, and we'll get to that in a minute, because not all your rewards are about more, more, more. If they were, none of us would be here. But let's just take a step back and say, how much do we have to change? What's the magnitude of the problem? And you all know, or many of you know this, US is the biggest contributor to the total CO2 excess in the atmosphere. And because carbon dioxide lasts 1,000 years, depending on the cycle and so on, China is now the largest emitter of carbon dioxide per year, but most of what's up there came from us. And I wondered when I went down this road, how much comes from things I control sort of in my own life, and how much comes from things I don't control. And you can argue this, different writers say 80-20, 60-40, 70-30, but if you put it all together, as a rough estimate, about half comes from things, about half the carbon dioxide that we put up in the atmosphere comes from things we choose in our individual lives, and about half comes from companies, industries, institutions we don't control. You can argue this point, and there's a lot of variability because it's difficult to actually, depends on how you draw your circles, but as a talking point, that's a reasonable estimate. So let's talk about magnitude. In the US, per capita, we're about 18 to 20 tons of carbon dioxide per year. That was that big Macy's Thanksgiving Day, whatever he is, Pillsbury Doughboy balloon. The world average is 5 tons per person per year. Again, these are rough averages. You can find papers that say a little more, a little less. So they're the party balloons at the side of the Macy's parade. But to keep within 1.5 degrees C, let's say 1.5 to 2 degrees C, we have to get to 2.1 tons per person per year. That's a big drop. And what do we have to change? The things that are causing the problem in our own lives and collectively. So I didn't know when I started down this road. I'm a neurosurgeon. What did I know? Which are the behaviors that matter most in our individual lives in high-income countries? And I will tell you that when you ask even educated people, at least in the healthcare workforce, most people don't know the answer to this. They think it's bottles recycling, and they think it's, they just don't know. Why would they know? Why would anybody know this if they haven't been taught it? Transportation and fuel efficient or electric car or car free is one of the big things for most people. A plant-based diet. Most people don't know that, but that's one of the big sort of top 5. Home energy efficiency, air travel, at least on your personal side, it's 2 tons of carbon roughly to go to the West Coast and back from the East Coast, or go to a transatlantic flight, which is your entire year's allotment just about. And then population is another whole question that I won't get into for purposes of time, but we can discuss it if anyone's interested. So what I would ask is, are these changes easy or difficult? Are they rewarding? Well, maybe to some people, but for most people, it feels like you're just doing without or doing things that aren't more fun. In addition to the issue of sort of the basic reward value, pro-environmental behavior change also suffers from an agency problem. Humans are intensely rewarded by cause and effect, by doing something they need to get done, and it gets done and they check the box. So in hunter-gatherer society, you hunt an animal, you bring it back to your entire tribe or village, everyone's rewarded, it's great. You're a gatherer, you find things, you bring them back, you share them. it's immediately rewarding. You build a shelter. This happens to be a model of an ancient shelter that was built in Ireland. You chip a stone to make a knife. Like you're chipping away, and you end up with a knife that works. It's very rewarding. It's cause and effect, what we call agency. You do a great surgery, the kid ends up okay. It's immediately rewarding. But contrast that to my colleague here, Jonathan Slutzman, who's in our center riding his bike to work in Boston in December. He gets no immediate reward. And it's like not any more fun. In fact, it's a pain in the neck. So no wonder it's hard to get people to change. So one of the questions we had to ask is, how changeable is your reward system? Is this genetic? Is it built in? Or are we able to change what we find rewarding? And it turns out that your reward system is incredibly malleable, and it's also gullible. And here I don't mean gullible like people are dumb, they're easily persuaded. What I mean is, by this sense of the word gullible, it means that when you are told something by authority figures, you're more likely to change your behavior. And that makes sense evolutionarily, because if you were walking down the path and you were about to step on a fallen hornet's nest and your grandfather behind you said stop and you didn't stop, you were in trouble. So to a greater or lesser extent, from individual to individual, humans have that tendency, it was evolutionarily adaptive for our survival, that if somebody in authority told you to do something or told you not to do something, you did it. Because if you didn't, you were more at risk. And if you could not vary what you found rewarding from one culture to the next, from one epoch in your life where leaders change and families change and your location changes, if you didn't adapt, you weren't malleable to change what was rewarding, we wouldn't have survived, because humans have gone all over the world in every kind of culture and every kind of environment there is. So we had to be malleable and gullible. There are some studies that show this. The brain of people with anorexia has been shown to actually be rewarded by going without food. That's like 180 degrees a shift from survival value as you can get. And this example that's in the book, there's more detail, but I'll speak very briefly about cats in Europe in the Middle Ages versus ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, cats were revered. They were considered divine. In Middle Ages Europe, cats were tortured publicly. It was a great entertainment. Everybody clapped and cheered as the cats were tortured. Why? Because the religious leaders told them that the devil lived in cats. So what we now would find horrifying, they found rewarding and a positive entertainment. So what's rewarding can be changed. Until tablets were available, 4-month-old babies were not attached to their screens, which they can learn at 4 months to swipe in video games. And as the climate has gotten worse and worse and the carbon emissions are going up and up, we are all, not all of us, but many of us are changing what we find rewarding. So if you're the type that likes a Hummer and you're worried about climate change, you have an alternative now. You like a cool sports car, BMW has an electric version that costs over $100,000. If you're into, being rewarded by a high performance car. Or if you're into economy, the Nissan Leaf is an electric car that is inexpensive and, rewarding for other causes. If you are a clothes horse, you can bring your worn out clothes to the Fashion Institute of Technology, one of the premier fashion institutions of the world, and they will make an artistic darning of the holes in your sweaters for a small fee. And then you get a work of art and you still get to use the sweater. If you really like to redo your furniture, you can go to a thrift store and get cool stuff that is one of a kind for a lot cheaper and that is not a bad environmental investment. So the strategies for pro-environmental behavior are simple, and there's again, the book goes into this in a lot more detail, but we went through what works to change behavior in difficult problems. And the two we looked at in great detail were addiction behavior and also the Ebola epidemic as a change of cultural behavior that was really a difficult one. And there are some basic principles. One is you have to substitute a behavior that is more rewarding than the alternative. And so we call that substitution rather than curtailment. Like another way to say it is you do it differently, you don't do without. So in Pro-environmental behavior at the individual level, we can sell these things for their health co-benefits. If you walk more, if you take public transportation, which pollutes less, if you switch to renewable energy, these all have health benefits. And this is one of the things in the health sector that clinicians have been encouraged to promote to their patients. There are financial incentives potentially for businesses and institutions. I understand that currently these may be under threat, but even regulatory agencies like the Joint Commission for Hospitals, Health and Human Services, changing building codes, changing regulations, changing metrics, and changing laws, things like the Environmental Defense Fund, Conservation Law Foundation, and there are public pressure campaigns, which, again, can change local and national and even international regulatory climate to make the pro-environmental choice more rewarding than the alternative because of co-benefits. Then there's the concept of honeybee rewards. This is like embedding the pro-environmental thing into a reward that has nothing to do with climate. And I will say that the Ford company had a very clever idea when they brought out this first electric truck. They didn't market it as a green option. They marketed it as this can really win these car crushing truck competitions because the torque is so much better. And so they marketed it to people who cared about the power of trucks, not the pro-environmental behavior. In fact, that could be a turnoff. So that's what's called the honeybee reward. The honeybee doesn't go to the flower in order to pollinate it. It goes for the nectar, but the side effect is it pollinates it. So that's a whole concept of embedding the sort of hiding the environmental benefits under a benefit that people will accept, whether they're pro-environmental or not. But among those of us, like those of you at Mazzetti and some of you on the call, social rewards from like-minded people are maybe the biggest reward you're going to get. And this can happen from, CEOs in your organizations to your co-professionals and other people that are like-minded within your organization. That's a powerful social reward. And humans are designed, we had to be very, very rewarded for social reward. That's why clinicians love it when families say, thank you for helping my child. And it turns out that more, that bigger meal, that bigger house, that bigger car, that sort of incentive that many humans have, I won't say baked in because it is malleable. You get to a certain stage in life and you want to divest. You have too much stuff. It can, so it's not that these things they may be predispositions, but they're not hardwired. That's an important thing that we learned. And it turns out that when people have done long-term studies of what makes us actually happy, what gives us life satisfaction over decades, when people have been followed from the time they're early young adults or adolescents through their 90s, it turns out that there are two things that correlate with long-term life satisfaction. One is a sense of purpose, and the other is relationships. And this is much more than stuff, which is a short-term reward, but does not tend to correlate with long-term life satisfaction. So to close this part of the talk, the takeaways about the relationship between your brain and climate, pro-environmental behavior, is that pro-environmental behavior, it's challenging from a neural point of view. And when you make a pro-environmental pro-environmental decision, it's going to fail the gut check because evolution has not given you a gut check in this domain. You have limited agency. You won't feel the effect. You won't get a neon sign saying good work. You won't get much. You'll get somebody else who's like-minded saying, I'm glad you did that. And I'm going to give you an example of that in a minute. And it competes with many other short-range priorities in the hospital here for sure. Finances and how we look on the front page of the Boston Globe, and how the donors feel, how the trustees feel. There are many, many, many other short-range priorities beyond climate change, which tends to take a back seat in many organizations. Also, changing people's minds that something is important is easier than changing their behavior. And the only way you change behavior usually is you have to substitute new rewards for any rewards they're giving up, or at least make them equivalent. The reward mechanism, however, is inherently flexible, and what's rewarding can be changed. Laws, penalties, financial incentives can shift the reward utility equation, and pro-environmental rewards are oftentimes mostly social. And what you say and what you do is going to influence other people and shift cultural norms gradually over time. And I want to give you an example from 2 days ago. I know many of you are very, very, very well aware of what's going on our national stage. And here at my university and health system, everybody's been really, really nervous about these funding cuts and threats to research, threats to clinical care, threats to the university. And 2 days ago, Alan Garber, who's president of Harvard University, he happens to be a physician, sent out this letter saying, we're not going to go along with this. And I'll tell you that when I walked in the hospital this morning, there was a palpable change. At least, maybe I'm projecting, but I felt a palpable change in the spring in people's steps, feeling like this statement, which I'm sure was not from one individual, but from much, much thought over many months, just felt like a relief. And that's social reward. Nobody got paid more. Nobody's grants came back that had been stripped, but it was a social reward. And it is powerful. It is powerful and not to be underestimated. So I know you at Mazzetti and others know that the health sector causes harm because of environmental issues. And there have been many studies on this about how many dailies or DALYs, depending on how you pronounce it, disability associated life years happen because of emissions and toxicity related to the health sector itself. And for this reason, people in leadership in the US health sector have had calls to decarbonize from the National Academy of Medicine, the prior administration's Department of Health and Human Services call to action. And for this reason, institutions, including mine, have started to take action. This was 2021 when the Massachusetts General Hospital founded its Center for the Environment and Health. This was a physician-led and top-down initiative where our pillars were operations to deliver more sustainable health care, to do research and create new information, to engage our employees and patients, and to advocate for a healthy environment. And at the same time, National Academy of Medicine, Department of Health and Human Services, Healthcare Without Harm, others were saying that these are our goals. We need to work with industry to reduce scope 3, encourage scopes 1 and 2, encourage education, develop metrics, and I would add, although this wasn't part of this, do research to understand what works best in this space. But this takes homework. It's not easy. Who has time to do the kind of homework that was done in this particular study, which showed that in different places around the world, the carbon footprint, the greenhouse gas emissions for the same kind of procedures in different operating rooms was really variable. So it takes homework and investment of time and resources to figure out in each institution, each setting, where is this coming from and how do we work on it? And that's some of the work that Mazzetti does. And for these reasons, it's not like you can decide to be sustainable and just do it. You actually have to get some data. You have to get some information. So who should do sustainability? Most of us, everybody, some of us? How big should it be? And of our various actions, which one have the biggest impact? This book, The Sizosaurus, is a child's book, but we think about a climate Sizosaurus, like how big is what we can do? And it's not necessarily in the workplace. It may be as a physician, for example, if you testify in front of a lawsuit, you add input into the health effects of a legal action or a local regulation. And then how do you incentivize people? Is it part of our profession? And one of the things we found when we first started doing this work is, people said, I'm sorry, but I'm busy curing cancer. So I'm going to end with a few slides about our research sustainability group, which is we work with a nonprofit called My Green Lab. It's one of the larger research sustainability labs. And they started as a wet bench sustainability organization focused mostly on helping corporations decrease their carbon footprint. But you can use it in academic medical centers, but we weren't sure how well it applied. So being researchers, we actually wanted to study it. My Green Lab offers a 2-year certification process. It covers 14 domains, and they're not all on energy. They're also on things like purchasing, animal research, travel, and there are 5 levels of certification that labs can certify for, going from bronze all the way up to green. But we had questions about how would this apply to an academic medical center. We wanted to know what is the Sizosaurus, what is the environmental impact, and apart from taking My Green Lab's word for it, we wanted to measure it ourselves. We worked with a company called Elemental Machines that donated some of the equipment we used to measure plug load. We did solid waste audits. We wanted to know what's the cost or cost savings. Is it enough that the institution should support this for all labs? And what really is the acceptability to researchers? It takes time. How difficult is it? How did it make researchers feel? And how much work was it? It actually, you have to meet with the labs, you have to do baseline assessments, you have to pick interventions, you have to do post-intervention assessments. It takes time and effort, and we weren't sure whether labs would, just feel like this was not their shift. We really wanted to know how researchers feel about it. And the thing with the arrow at the bottom, we asked them, we designed a questionnaire with a human factors expert and a psychologist interested in climate change. There were more questions to this, but the one I'm pointing out is, how important is it to you that your employer has a long-term carbon footprint reduction plan that meaningfully supports global climate goals? Like, do you care about this at all, or it's very important to you? We really didn't know where we were starting. So I'll just briefly say what the findings are. These can all be found in a report that we published in a peer-reviewed journal, Journal of Climate Change and Health. And the link to that report is at the bottom if you're interested in it. But basically, here's what we found. The program was cost effective. It pretty much paid for itself. And then probably there were additional savings that we were unable to measure that made it even more cost effective for the institution. The researchers were incredibly engaged. They thought climate change and sustainability was really important, but they didn't know where to start. Like, most of them didn't have the background. Like, it was just extra work, and having a program that basically walked them through this and taught them about it was very, very well appreciated. Culture change was facilitated by the fact, one of the things My Green Lab does that I think is genius, 50% of the individuals that work in the lab have to sign up in order to get certified, and they have to go through the process. And that requirement for 50% minimum involvement really, really helped. I became a total advocate for that approach. It also facilitated crosstalk among silos. So people that are, cancer researchers, neurology researchers, they didn't know who the building engineers were. They didn't know who the waste management people were. Like, they never talked to these people. And we found that just going through the program opened up channels of communication that really were helpful in a complex organization. It prompted a system-wide waste summit that I'll talk about in a minute. And because of these preliminary findings, we now are doing a much broader pilot across MGB in many more labs. This was our Waste Summit. It brought together people from all these different aspects of the institution that had never met, many of them, or little clusters of them had met, but not all of them. And what we were trying to do is the old sort of ways you make decisions with efficacy, cost, and safety. Now we're going to have a fourth circle here: efficacy, cost, safety, and environmental impact. It's just embedding that into your thinking for all your decisions, your purchasing decisions, your operational decisions, your waste decisions. And it was not such a weird thing because we had gone through the sustainability certification project, which softened everybody up and gave them a common language to discuss. There are still opportunities for study. What about some of the newer kinds of research, computational research that uses AI and large amounts of computational power? Not much is known about that yet. Genomic research, which uses both computation and lots of equipment, is another thing that needs to be explored. Imaging research, high definition MRIs. We have an MRI on our campus that does research that has been stated as using the same amount of energy as a nuclear submarine. I don't know if that's true, but these things are enormously energy dependent, and we need to study them. We found that we needed to update ambiguous hazardous waste policies. Different labs were doing things differently because there's some sort of interpretation, and we're updating those. And we had to really look at cost savings incentives, like reusing things instead of discarding. But it takes a new way of thinking and a new way of, and it's work, it's homework, it's work that these researchers are not being paid to do. So it's kind of who does it. The idea of a green bank has come up, and we're exploring that as something that gives people potentially direct incentives, direct financial incentives. And we can talk more about that if people are interested. Changing the culture, does it actually change behavior in the workplace, in other roles? If you're the vice president of your national research association and you're thinking of a meeting, maybe because this is on your mind, you might offer a hybrid option, which really cuts down the carbon footprint of national professional meetings. And does it spread to other people? So these are things we are still studying. And because I'm interested in brain and behavior, I'm very interested in how does this change your reward calculations, your utility calculations for your own decisions. And so I'll end with saying, what is our vision for the future? We can think about our 3-year plan, our 5-year plan, but it's hard for us to think of our 50 to 100-year plan. And we are not evolved to think about that easily, but it's our job. Those of us who are we're scientifically educated, we understand some of these issues. We can do cognitive override of our short-term instincts to think like this deliberately, think with other people, think with people like those of you listening to this about creative solutions and how to overcome things and think more long term. So with that, I will stop sharing and turn it back over to you, Christina.
Thank you. All right, let me just pull up the Q&A. So you can use the Q&A function to ask questions of our presenter today. We have a few minutes here where we can take your questions. We have one question that's come in so far. The WHO defines DALY, you said it's pronounced different ways, disability adjusted life years, states that children are more likely to be affected by climate rather than air and noise quality, which affects adults. How do we further this knowledge?
Yeah, great question. And, it's in part because people don't know or they can't perceive it. So an asthma attack, people can understand. All sorts of short-term things you've seen, things you can picture, things you've experienced, people can see. Climate change is a little vague and fuzzy. People don't quite understand it. And the project that Christina mentioned that I'm involved in, actually leading on climate change, war, and health, one of our main goals is to take that data and use the principles that people have actually done research on. What is effective climate communication? And we intend, it's going to be a long haul to try to accomplish this. We intend to make films that show people stories, because telling stories is what makes it tangible and comprehensible to people. And our model for the stories we hope to tell once we have data that we are very confident in is the 1983 film called The Day After. Mm-hmm. And it was a network broadcast film that showed a fictionalized version of what would happen if there was a nuclear strike on the United States. And it had characters that had families, that had jobs, that were making plans. And it showed in sort of graphic detail what would happen if that happened. And it brought those scientifically validated eventualities to the public consciousness. And it also affected policymakers. So there is good evidence that Ronald Reagan, who watched that film, had his mind changed about nuclear war, and that was one of the factors that prompted him and his administration to change their attitude towards nuclear treaties. And so to change the idea of, people don't, the general public doesn't understand DALYs. So we have to take our clues from the climate communicators who study this and constantly be ready to change and actually tell stories that people can understand. So I'd be interested on other opinions, but that's the direction I'm going in, because charts and graphs have been shown not to be terribly effective.
Storytelling is an important tool in our toolkit, for sure. I have another question. Can you talk about the impact of extreme weather events on behavior change or impact on the reward and incentive motivators?
Yeah, I sure can. So there's a fair amount of research on this, actually, and more is coming out. But one of the things is profiles of people who actually express pro-environmental views and take pro-environmental actions. Now, how you define that is different in different research contexts. But one of the things that tips people's scale on average is having been exposed to an extreme weather event. So people who have been exposed to floods, wildfires, big storms and hurricanes are on average much more likely to vote for candidates, for example, that express pro-environmental views, or become more pro-environmentally active in their own lives or in their advocacy roles. So when you see it up close and personal, it's not like it's a one-to-one correlation, like everybody that's been through a hurricane, votes for climate action. But on average, it is one of those important things. That's why people on the coasts tend to be more pro-environmental in terms of voting and regulations and laws than people in other locations, because sea level rise is very, very visible. And so are storms that involve the ocean, like hurricanes.
I have another question here, a little bit more about the Green Labs program. So who supported and provided incentives for your Green Labs certification program?
Yeah, great question. So I am not paid by My Green Lab, but I will tell you that my experience with them was fantastic. They bent over backwards to support us with in-kind time and expertise. And they allowed us to use quite a low rate. I mean, it's their sort of academic rate to for a lab to get certified. But I'll tell you what it cost us in our most recent pilot, and I don't think they would mind saying this because they would love to give it away for free, but that's not a sustainable business model for them, and it does take personnel to run the program that they run. They do all these analyses of the lab's data from the questionnaires that the labs fill out. They give you, PowerPoints and reports and links to resources if you want to learn more. They evaluate you before and after your interventions. So they do a lot of work. They actually put a lot of effort into bringing labs along the process. But they charged us $400 for a 2-year certification per lab. Now, a lab can have 20, 30, 50 people in it. And so it's $200 a year for your certification. And that's why it was so cost effective for the institution, because the interventions saved that easily. And those were just some of the ones we could measure. So it really was cost effective. We're now piloting their next version of My Green Lab. It's My Green Lab 2.0 or whatever, which is now going to be the standard version. And in that version, they actually build in both a somewhat externally verified environmental impact measurements and potential cost saving measurements that they standardize to your location. So that helps give you more information to your organization about the potential cost effectiveness. But to answer the direct question, our first pilot was only 5 labs, and it was supported by our research institute, the Mass General Research Institute. Our second pilot is 20 additional labs across the institution and more different kinds of labs. And that was supported from the Office of Academic Affairs, just for the upfront costs and a little bit of time and things like, pizza parties for the labs to, nothing brings people together like food.
Like pizza, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's organic, free range pizza. But in any event, it really is a minimal investment. But it does bring up a question of, it does take time. And the time that I'm a neurosurgeon, although I am not at this point operating on children. I am still seeing patients and I'm still doing a lot of my research, but I really have switched my career because the time it takes to do this environmental work just doesn't mesh with the time it takes to be in an emergency-based specialty where you have to be available 24/7. And so I will say that that is the biggest question. Whose job is it? Some hospitals have green teams, they have this, they have that. But as a researcher, I found it made my involvement and also somebody who's interested in behavior change helpful when I went into the labs because I am a researcher. I understand what they're going through and where their priorities are coming from better than, say, a project manager who doesn't have that background. That doesn't mean somebody other than a physician or a clinician researcher couldn't do the work, but I think it was helpful as we were getting our feet wet in this area to have that knowledge. So that's who supported it. And now, the question for us is, do we make this available to all labs? Do we make it mandatory for all labs? And we're still figuring that out. So I don't think we have a final answer, but I think the institution sees the value of the program.
What were some of the most impactful changes that your labs adopted during the pilot? Like, what are some of the practical elements that they adopted?
Yep. So the ones that were easiest for us to measure had to do with cold storage and turning ultra cold freezers from -80 to -70. Now, here's what we found. I mean, we're an institution that has a lot of very competitive, high-powered researchers, and not every researcher was willing to change their freezer from -80 to -70. And so we came to realize that there is a wealth of knowledge still waiting to be found. And there are gaps in the knowledge base. And the scientists often said, can you prove to me that my samples won't be degraded if I switch from -80 to -70? And we had to do some research on that. In fact, we have collected with our research collaborators some data on what's the quality of the sample if you freeze it at -70 and you freeze another one at -80 and you thaw it at 3 months or 6 months or a year and you do quality checks. That has not been published in the peer review literature. And so
Mhm.
there are some data gaps that need to be filled. But for those labs that had short-term storage and were comfortable switching from -80 to -70, that was one of the big interventions. But it's even better if you can do in academic medical centers where there are postdocs that come and go and researchers that move and so on. Many people are keeping ultra cold freezers around with samples that nobody even knows who they belong to or why they're there. So one of the steps is taking an inventory and getting rid of stuff once you're comfortable that no one's ever going to use it. It's been sitting there and you don't even know what it is, and turning a freezer off. Like
Mhm.
that's hugely cost effective. Fume hoods. Keep it. We went into one because one of the things we do is go to the labs and actually walk around and see and become friendly with the researchers. And one lab was very pleased with themselves because they had bought some new fume hoods that were brand new and supposed to be more energy efficient. They had had some old clunkers that were rusty and had chemical spills and you name it. And so they showed us these beautiful ones. And I noticed as we looked that they were open about an inch at the bottom. And I said, wait a minute, this is open. And they said, well, that's as low as it goes. It must be designed that way. And what we figured out by fiddling around was that there was a little catch. You had to press a button to get the sash all the way down. And so
Ah,
they had these energy efficient sashes that they weren't closing because they didn't understand that you had to do something to get it to close the whole way. And a fume hood uses the same amount of energy as a house.
mhm.
So those are like easy ones, right? And then there were other simple ones that our institution had already done, like changing all the lights to LED, putting things on motion sensor. But I'll tell you one story. One of the labs was the researchers were very concerned about air turnover. And there are, as you folks know at Mazzetti and elsewhere, there are codes, building codes that require a high turnover in research labs for air exchange because presumably there are toxic chemicals and so forth. But what if nobody's in the lab? And so can you put the high rate of air turnover on a motion detector? So if people come in at night because there's an experiment that has to be done at 10 p.m. or whatever, the air turnover can turn on. Well, some of the researchers were uneasy with that. Like, I don't want to breathe toxic fumes. So the institution is doing a pilot where they're actually putting air quality sensors in these labs and testing what would happen. So because we're doing this as a research project to try to answer some of these questions that the researchers come up with, it's feeling very collaborative. Like the researchers are interested in finding out what the results are. So those are some of the big ones, are, sort of HVAC and that sort of stuff. I mean, we have $1 billion research enterprise and it's in owned buildings, leased buildings, off-campus buildings, buildings that are in the clinical spaces. I mean, it's all over the place. And so it's a lot of work to figure it out. But our reward, my personal reward, is how engaged these researchers are. I mean, we have people that have won, these incredible international science rewards, and they want to know about sustainability because they recognize this is a big problem. So I hope that answers the question. But those are some of the easy ones, and there may be different ones for your institution. But we have been really gratified at how people say, I've been so worried about this, but I didn't know where to start. So job satisfaction and satisfaction with the institution has been our reward.
Wow, thank you so much for your advocacy in this space. We are all better off knowing that this research is getting done because these are the exact kind of questions we face when we work on lab spaces every day. So this research that you're doing is really important. Thank you. Thank you all for attending today. We really appreciate everybody's quite great questions and your time this morning. Next month, we will be focusing on electrifying heat in healthcare. And we're going to have Jeff Glass, who formerly with Providence Health, who co-authored a really interesting study on this very topic. And I think you'll find this fascinating. Please note that next month we will be meeting at 9 Pacific rather than 8 Pacific. So mark your calendars now. and we look forward to seeing you next month. Happy Earth Month, everyone, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you. Bye.
All right, all good?
All set.
All right.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating.
Well, some people find it interesting. Some people are like, what are you talking about? Maybe you'll get some feedback and find out, but thank you for moderating. You did a nice job. Were those all your questions or questions actually?
No, they had about 3 or 4 questions came in. So
all right, that's good.
They did a nice job asking really great questions today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and I hope to work with you folks again.
All right, thank you. See you. Bye-bye.